All right, welcome back to another study in the Gospel of John. Today we are in John 18, 1 to 27. Shall I not drink the cup? This is what the question Jesus asks. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father's given me? And so in this passage, we're going to learn that Jesus' death is propitiatory, which means it absorbs God's wrath. Jesus' death is propitiatory. And then secondly, we'll look at the idea that Jesus' death is substitutionary. So the context here is Jesus has left the upper room. He's given his high priestly prayer that we saw in John 17. And now he's going to be arrested. And it seems like things aren't working out. But we're going to learn that this is part of the plan. Jesus is absorbing God's wrath, or about to, and he's also substituting himself for sinners. And that's what comes out in 18, 1 to 27. In 18, 1 to verse 11, again, we learn that Jesus' death is propitiatory. You see this as you look down at verse 11. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father's given me?" Now, we'll get there, but what happens is Peter tries to defend Jesus and keep him from being arrested. But Jesus says, I've got to drink the cup the Father's given me. And the cup is a symbol of God's wrath. Different times in the Old Testament, the cup refers to drinking down the blessing of God, but it also sometimes refers to drinking down the wrath of God. And that's what Jesus is getting at. Peter, don't stop me from being arrested and then dying, because I've got to drink this cup of God's wrath. I've got to stand in the way of God's wrath and absorb it so that you and others don't. That's what's being taught here. So in verse 1, it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, and we're going to see, again, opposition to Jesus here. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then notice, Jesus knows what's going on. He's in control. This is part of the plan. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" Even Jesus walking into the arrest, into the betrayal, shows that this is part of the plan. He's got to do this, and he willingly does it. "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." The I am statements in John are a big deal. Jesus confirming that he is Yahweh. He is the door. He is the shepherd. He is the light, and so on. So he says, "I am he." That's a strong statement. Judas, who betrayed him, again, the opposition to Jesus keeps coming out, even though we know that Jesus is sovereign here. We're still seeing a lot of the opposition. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. He's no longer with Jesus. He's no longer with his disciples. He's with the enemy. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. The importance or the truth of who Jesus was, the greatness of who he was, even just communicated verbally, brought them to the ground. You could say there's a lot behind those words, "I am he." So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you, I am he," third time. "So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "Of those whom you gave me, I lost one." Remember, he just prayed to his Father to keep the disciples. And so the Father answers that prayer in a number of ways, but here, first and foremost, he answers it right away when Jesus is arrested by not allowing the disciples to be arrested at this point. And that's what the text tells us. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, struck the high priest. I want you to notice the difference between Peter's actions and Jesus' actions. Judas and the enemies of Jesus come. Jesus steps forward into the arrest. Peter tries to keep Jesus from being arrested. Two opposite responses here. So Peter draws a sword and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. This isn't a time for defense. This isn't a time to rescue me. Why? Shall I not drink the cup that the Father's given me? Jesus had to absorb the wrath of God, and he knows it. He knows it all during the arrest. He's not surprised by Judas. He's not surprised by the Jewish leaders coming after him. In fact, he walks into it. Why? Because he loves you and he loves me. He did this for us. He walked into and absorbed the wrath of God, and that was the plan. And neither Peter or anybody else could keep him from that. So, Jesus' death is propitiatory. It absorbed the wrath of God that we deserve. And so, you could say that salvation is hiding behind Jesus as he receives the wrath of God, as he steps forward to receive the wrath of God. And we see, again, his death being propitiatory in verses 1 to 11. We also see in verses 12 to 27 that Jesus' death is substitutionary. It's in our place. John 18, 12 to 27. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus. Now I'm going to circle all the things that, again, show opposition and what might look like to an observer during this whole thing, defeat, downfall, problems for Jesus. He's arrested. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. That's not good. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And then verse 14 really gives us an insight into what's happening here. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. So again, Caiaphas is telling the Jewish leaders, listen, if we kill him, it'll stop the problems from happening. We'll keep the ability to do what we want. Rome won't be upset with us. Let's kill him for the sake of all of our people. Well, the irony of that. And the writer of John himself, writes and shows the irony here. Caiaphas himself said that one should die for all the people. Now, Caiaphas didn't mean what we understand that to mean, but that is what ended up happening. Jesus died for you and me. He died for sinners. So one man did die for the people. And that the Apostle John bringing that out in verse 14 is meant to kind of arrest our attention, and we understand that, Jesus substituted himself for the people. Now, again, just like in the previous point, there's a lot of betrayal, there's arresting, there are bad things happening, and so it looks like there's this defeat of Jesus, but his plan is being done. He is the substitutionary sacrifice that we need. And so in the next verses, 15 to 18, we learn about Peter's failure. So I'm just going to, again, point you to verse 12. Jesus is arrested, he's bound. I'm just going to write failure up here. Question mark. This is looking like failure. This doesn't look good. But Caiaphas says something that John inserts to his gospel message that's meant to get our attention. He's dying for all the people. Just keep that in the back of your head. Now we learn about another failure. It's Peter's failure. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. So that disciple was known to the high priest. He entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I'm not." There's another failure. So Jesus is arrested. He's bound. Peter's failing him. Verse 18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. This could be a nod to the fact that Jesus is suffering and dying. It's part of his plan, and his failed disciple is trying to receive some comfort by denying Jesus. Maybe there's that intention there. I think there's perhaps something there. But again, what I want you to see here is Jesus has been arrested and bound, verses 12 to 14. Peter's now failing himself. This is not looking good. Then verse 19. Failure? Is Jesus a failure? The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who've heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. When he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? And Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Jesus is treated like a criminal. He's not a criminal. He's questioned like a criminal. He tells the truth. He tells the truth, and he's struck. That doesn't look good. And then this whole thing ends, this part of the trial ends with Jesus being led away bound. Again, a lot of failure, it looks like. But don't forget verse 14. It would be expedient that one man should die for the people. This was not a failure to us. We don't see this as a failure. We see this as Jesus going through it for us. So we have the verse 14 reality in our mind, even while all around us there's failure, failure, failure. Jesus knows exactly what's happening. This is not a failure. He's being arrested and dying for us, for the people. Verse 25, Simon Peter's failure again. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I'm not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. Jesus prophesied this, again showing Jesus is sovereign. He knows the plan. He knows what the next hour is going to bring. He knows what the next few hours are going to bring. He knows that he's going to the cross, and all around him, failure, failure, failure. But after this, when Peter's convicted of sin, what should Peter take heart in? What should he hold on to? What would bring him some encouragement in light of his failures? Verse 14, Jesus, the one man, died for his people, including those sins of denial that Peter just went through. 3 denials, God's grace overcame that because Jesus died as a substitute for Peter and for us. And that's what's happening in John 18, 1 through 27. Jesus comes, and no matter what's going on around him, he shouldn't be arrested. He's bound. This isn't good. No. He's absorbing the wrath of God. Jesus is arrested. He's bound. Peter's failing. Peter's failing again. Peter's failing again. He's questioned like a criminal. He's bound again, brought to another trial. This doesn't look good. No, Jesus is the substitutionary sacrifice for us. And that's what the Gospel of John is showing us in 18:1 to 27.